Hi, here is a video of me, Pippin Bar, doing the haiku generator activity. So, as always, I'm just going to go through it step by step, talk about what I'm thinking as I do each step, and hopefully I won't make too many mistakes while I'm doing it. Let's get started. So over here in my browser, I have the activity text. Hopefully there aren't any mistakes in this too. So the concept here with this activity is we're working with HTML and CSS. And in particular, we're working with JavaScript and the document object model, the DOM, in order to just look at ways that we can manipulate a web page from within JavaScript, moving beyond the idea, for example, of just using a canvas element and actually playing with the elements on a page. And so what I want us to do is create a haiku generator. A haiku is a kind of a poem. In the most sort of anal version, you have a 5-syllable line, then a 7-syllable line, and then a 5-syllable line. And it's a often quite ambiguous poem, often about nature. So what we're going to have is a page that generates a random haiku and displays it to the user in HTML and CSS. And then if the user clicks on individual lines, it will swap out that line. And we're going to have a fade in, fade out, and fade in effect, which will maybe be our most kind of sophisticated programming moment. So how are we going to do it? Well, first thing we need to do is start a project. We could start from scratch, but I'm going to download the plain JavaScript project template, which is very handily linked here. There we go. That ends up on my desktop. I'll delete the zip file, and I'm going to copy that over into my activities folder. So there it is there, plain JavaScript project. Pop it into my activities folder, and I'm going to rename it haiku generator. Now I'm ready to start work on this, right? So I'll drag it into Atom. I'll open this index.html, and I'll open the script, and I'll open the CSS file. These are all things I might want to do something with. And with that in place, I can go over to GitHub Desktop and commit that. So started haiku generator activity. As always, I probably won't actually commit during this process just to save a bit of time, but it's always smart to commit maybe after each major step or something like that. But I'm not that smart. So here we go. What's our plan? So our plan is a kind of a 4-step process. The first thing we want to do is generate a random haiku. So we'll look at how to do that. Then we'll actually take the step of getting the haiku out of our JavaScript program and displaying it on the web page. To do that, we will of course need to use the document object model, the document variable in JavaScript. Then we'll add the basic interaction that you can click on online and it will swap to a new random line. And then we'll add that kind of visual flourish of having a fade in and fade out effect, just to see a little bit of this idea of animating things on a web page and what that might take. So let us begin with step 1. Generate a random haiku in JavaScript. So as I said, the pedantic version of a haiku is 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables. So Basho is probably the most famous haikuist. Obviously, Basho's haiku were written in Japanese. It's a Japanese poetry form. But for example, we have one here. In the twilight rain, these brilliant-hued hibiscus, a lovely sunset. So the haiku it's a beautiful form because it's very short, and the ambiguity, I think, allows you to inject a lot of your own emotional context into the nature of the poem. So what we want to do is randomly generate these, a little bit less sophisticated than Basho probably, but we'll do our best, right? So to do that, we're going to need to have some data from which to generate our haiku. And what we're going to do is we're just going to have random lines pre-written that we can choose from. So what we want is a couple of arrays, right? We want an array of 5-syllable lines, and we want an array of 7-syllable lines that we can choose from randomly. So let's do that. So back over here in our script, let me fill this in quickly. So this is called haiku generator. My name is Pippin Bar. Let's say, let's just have a quick little description here for the moment. Generates a random haiku. And what are we going to do? So we want a couple of arrays. The first one's going to be called 5-syllable lines And I've suggested here that we have at least 5 5-syllable strings in the array. Each one of those strings is going to be a potential line of the poem. So let 5-syllable lines be an array. And inside this array, I want my poetry lines. I'm going to do each one on a new line. It's tempting to try and compose poetry in front of you, but I'm actually just going to use the lines that are provided here. So we've got O to be a tree, O to be a tree. Very poetic O there, you can see, with the just the letter O. The cat does not know. That's a good one too. The cat does not know. Deep. And we are all forests. We are all forests. And you have done your best. You have done your best. I totally recommend coming up with your own. They are all gone now. It's pretty satisfying. Obviously, I came up with these ones earlier. But there's a really interesting effect, I think, of when you see your own texts kind of remixed. It feels like something. So these are going to be the potential 5-syllable lines that are going to be used in our poem. And as it says here, we want to do the same thing for 7-syllable lines as well, because there's one 7-syllable line. So our 7-syllable lines is another array, and it's going to be the same thing, right? Let me just copy these. Say the things left unsaid. Super deep. Never believe the wind's lies. Equally deep. The autumn stretches its legs. I'm quite proud of that one. Nothing can satisfy you. So true. So true. Except a Coca-Cola. No, this is not an ad for Coke. They will not come again. Who are they? That is the ambiguity of that line. Pronouns are good for that, right? Okay. So we've got our pool of data with which to generate poems. It's reasonably simplistic what we're doing, right? We're just picking things out of arrays and saying that they're a poem. But that's how poetry works. So now we're actually in a position to generate this poem. We know that basically all that we want to do is pick a random line from the 5, a random line from the 7, and then another random line from the 5, and that will be our haiku. And we can compose our haiku out of that, and then for now we're just going to print it out into the JavaScript console rather than dealing with the web page itself. Now, we could just go ahead and do that, but I think that we're going to benefit from writing a function that will pick random elements from an array. You might be used to working with a framework like P5 where there's a random function that already does that, but when we're writing plain JavaScript for a web page, there isn't actually a function for just choosing a random element from an array, so we actually need to write it ourselves. So let's define a function called random that allows us to provide it with an array, and it's going to give us back a random element from that array. So how are we going to do that? Well, first let's define the function. So at the bottom of our program, which currently is just here, right? We say function random, and it takes one parameter, which is an array. We know that that array is either going to be the 5-syllable array or the 7-syllable array, depending on which one we pass through. Now, how do we choose a random element from this array? There's a magical formula for doing this. The thing that we're wanting to do, right, is we're wanting to find a random index in the array. So basically, depending on how long the array is, we want to either pick out the 0, the 1, 2, 3, the 4, etc., depending on how many elements there are. We want to randomly choose a number between 0 and the length of the array. But we want to choose it between 0 and the length of the array minus 1, technically, because we know that we start counting from 0. So the magical formula for this is here. I've written it in the notes just because I think it's easier to just see it. And it is that we take the floor of a random number times the length of the array. So let's just paste that in for now. So we're going to declare a variable in our function called index. This is going to be the randomly chosen index of the array, and we're going to assign it this. So index is assigned this thing here. Now how is this working? Well, math.random is the plain JavaScript way of asking for a random number between 0 and 1. So maybe it'll be 0.5, maybe it'll be 0.977777771, you don't know. It's going to be a number between 0 and up to, but not including 1. So it could be 0.999999999, but it will never be 1. If we multiply the length of the array by this random number between 0 and 1, we're going to end up with a number between 0, of course, because if the random number is 0, we get 0 back, all the way up to just before the length of the array, right? Because math.random never returns 1, we're never going to get array.length. We'll always get the number just before array.length. So if our array, for example, is 5 elements large, which our ones are, then we might get 4.999999999. We would never get 5, which is the actual length of the array. So that's good because that's giving us a random number within 0 up to the length, but not including the length. But we can't use a number like 1.2345 or something to ask for something in an array, right? We can't use floating point numbers. We need integers. So to convert this number into an integer, we're using math.floor. And what that does is just chops off everything after the decimal point. So for instance, if the math.random part returned 3 point blah, 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 like this, we can't use this to ask for an element in an array, but if we take the floor, basically it goes from the point and it just deletes everything. So you just end up with 3. Same thing if we have 2 point blah, 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 blah. Math.floor will take everything after the whole number and get rid of it, so you just get 2. So by using math.floor on this, we end up with either 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the case of our 5 element arrays, right? And that's perfect because that lets us pick one of the lines in that array. Now you can think about this as a magical incantation if you want to, or you can think about it and come to terms with how it's really working. That's completely up to you. This is a very common formula for choosing a random thing from an array. So once we've got this random index, we can then return the element from the array at that index. So we can say return array at position index, and that is going to return a random element from this array. Perfect, that's what we want, right? So this is like a helper function, right? We're going to be wanting to choose random elements from arrays, and so it makes sense to write a function that will do that for us. Okay, and we just did this step here, right? So now we're in a position to actually choose random elements from our syllable arrays because we wrote our helper function. So back at the top, after our current variables, we can declare a variable called line1, and we can assign it a random element from the 5 syllables array to choose our first line. Let's do that. So after we've got these things, let's say let line1 is assigned a random element from which one? The 5 syllable lines array. So we pass the 5 syllable lines array, and our magical helper function will give us a random one of these 5 lines, because that's what it's designed to do. And then we will do the same for line 2 and line 3, right? Remembering the structure of a haiku. So line 2 is a random element from the 7 syllable lines array, and line 3 is a random element from, again, the 5 syllable lines array. And that's actually composed our poem, our 3-line haiku. We've got line 1, line 2, and line 3. Each one of these is being assigned a random element from the appropriate array, and that actually creates our poem. So we've actually made the poem now. It remains to print out the poem. So let's actually print the poem using console.log. I'm just going to use 3 console.logs here to print out the 3 lines of the poem. So let's go and do that. Obviously at this point there's still no output from this program, so there's not much point in running it. So let's give it the output. So console.log line 1, console.log line 2, and oh goodness me. That was interesting. I don't quite know how I did that. Console.log, line 3. Okay. So now I can run this. And obviously I see nothing on the web page. Oh, and I'm reminded, change this title in index.html. There's some good advice from me. I'm going to bring up the JavaScript console, because that's where I said I would print it out. And voila. Here it is. And there's even a little extra bit of poetry. So, oh, to be a tree, say the things left unsaid. Oh, to be a tree, live reload enabled. That's great. So that's a good poem. And if I reload the page, right, the program will run again. Oh, to be a tree, the autumn stretches its legs. They are all gone now. Maybe that's about its leaves falling off. So you can kind of see how the poem bit is working, right? The ambiguity of the lines and then the kind of extra specificity that we get when we combine lines is creating something more meaningful than any one line. They are all gone now. Say the things left unsaid. Oh, to be a tree. Beautiful. Beautiful, beautiful. Live reload enabled. Never forget that line. Live reload enabled. It's only 6 syllables, so it doesn't really fit the haiku form. That's okay. So we've got a poem. We've done the key kind of task, the key procedural task is to generate a poem, and we have done that. Let's get on to the visuals. So the first thing we want to do is we want to display this poem on the web page instead of in the JavaScript console, because not many people browse the web with the JavaScript console open. And how are we going to do that? Well, we need some HTML on our page, and I'll remember to change the title at the same time, that can contain the poem, and that we can then use JavaScript to inject the poem onto the page, right? So let's go and do that. So the first thing we should do is it makes sense to have a kind of container for the poem. It's going to be 3 individual lines, right? But we should have something that contains the whole poem. So we're going to add a section tag that will contain the whole haiku, and we may as well give it an ID, something like, dare I say, haiku. So we're going to do this in index.html, and I'm going to remember to change this. I'm going to call it haiku generator. I'm not going to be clever here, because I'm not clever. So where do we put our HTML? We always put our HTML inside the body tag. And I said we would make a section tag with an ID of haiku. And I will close the section tag here. So that's where our poem is going to be put in. But I don't want to just put all of the text in here, because it's not going to be laid out very nicely. So we also want some more tags that will help to lay out the poem. And I'm suggesting here that we just use p tags. There are other ways of doing it, but p tags, they're a nice way to lay out some poetry, I think. So 3 p tags. Each one will have an individual ID so that we can target them from JavaScript, line -1, line -2, line -3, or something similar. And that's where we're going to place the 3 lines of the haiku that we generate in our JavaScript. So let's add those 3 p tags. So p ID is line 1. That's our first p tag. And p ID equals line 2 is our second p tag. And p ID equals, guess what? Line 3. Closing the p tag. So again, like if we go and look at this web page again over here, there's nothing there, right? Because there's still no content on the page. There's only structure. We've got a structure in place with this section and these p tags to inject some information, but at present we don't see anything. And that's fine. Okay, let's go back to our instructions. So the big step now to make these things visible is, instead of using console.log to make our poem visible, let's replace it by getting access to those 3 p tags and putting our poem into those positions. So first of all, let's delete those console.logs. Who needs them anyway? Bye-bye. Now, let's do the more sophisticated thing. So the first thing we need to do is we need access to the 3 p tags. And we know that we can get access to them perhaps most easily because we want to access specific ones by using getElementById. So we're going to use getElementById with the IDs, and we're going to store each line's p tag in a separate variable. I'm suggesting line 1p, line 2p, and line 3p. You can call it something else if you want to. So let line 1p, paragraph, be assigned document.getElementById, what's the element ID? It's line -1. That will give me the p tag, or the p element, inside my variable, and I want to do that exact same kind of thing 2 more times, right? For line 2 and for line 3. So now I've got a reference in my JavaScript program to the p elements on my web page, and that means I can start manipulating them, right? And in particular, I can add my actual poem to them. How am I going to do that? I use the inner text property of those p elements because that's how we can set the textual value of an element on the web page. And we're going to set the inner text to the appropriate line of the haiku, which we've got stored in our variables. Okay, so we're going to say line 1p.innerText is assigned line 1. And we'll do the same thing for line 2 and line 3. It's not rocket science. You can see it's sort of repetitive here. You could probably come up with a slightly less repetitive way of doing this if you felt like it. Line 3. Oh, line 13. This doesn't exist. Okay, so now we've done the key thing that we need to do to get our poem into the document via the document object model, which is that we get hold of each p tag, put them in variables, and then we set their inner text to the appropriate line. What does that mean? It means that now we should be able to see the poem on the web page. And there it is. We are all forests. They will not come back again. You have done your best. You have done your best. You are doing your best right now. So what do we see here? We see the complete default formatting of a web page with p tags in a section with our poem in it. So, it's working. Now when I reload the page, we get poems. Wonderful. They're all gone now. They will not come back again. They are all gone now. That is very poignant, if I do say so myself. Let me just continue admiring my own poems. So it looks very default. This is not a project where we need to have a lot of CSS, but it's nice to have a bit of CSS just to make things look a bit more fun. So let's select the section and change the font at least. So we know that the ID of the section is haiku, so let's add a little bit of style to the section. At least font family and font size seems reasonable. This is kind of up to you. Do what you want. You can leave it in the default if you want to. I'm just going to do a tiny bit. So to select the section by its ID, we use hash because that's how we select an ID, and then haiku, which is the ID of the section. And I'm going to set the font family to my favorite font, Helvetica. It's actually not my favorite font anymore. Actually, let's not go there. Helvetica, and then sans serif as a fallback. And font size, I want it to be bigger. I'm going to make it 2 rem. So let's have a look at that. Yeah, that looks poetic. I'm going to make them bold as well. So I'm going to use font weight, bold. Lovely. And then, there's infinite things that we could do at this point. Maybe I could set the margin to auto. That will do nothing because I haven't set a width yet. Let me set a width of what? Goodness me, what am I doing? 80 view width, maybe? I'm just messing around now. No. Pippin, calm down. That looks fine. Don't worry. Okay. And we could also select the body and maybe set a background color. And we could do width and margins there too, I guess. I'm just going to set a background color. I don't want to get too tied up in the styling. So because the body is like the preeminent tag, I'm going to style it at the very top here. And I'm just going to set a background color of, I know that there's something like called, what was it, Rebecca Purple or something? Purple Rebecca? I can't remember. That's such a funny name. Anyway, let me just use something here. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, that came out well. That's a bit dour though, isn't it? Let's ABC Bab. Yeah, that's perfect. ABC Bab is a great color if you didn't know about it. ABC Bab. So looks good. That looks like a haiku-y color. I'm not gonna, you can hear me getting obsessed and I'm not going to. Okay. So the page looks a little bit better. Looks good enough. So what's our next step? Well, we want to be able to click on a line and change it out, right? So kind of like Raymond Queneau's 100 000 milliards de poèmes, this sort of giant generative poem that he wrote. This idea that the poem is kind of flexible for the person who's reading it, not just that the poem gets generated by the program, but the user can have some impact. So we want a user to click on a line and we will swap it for another line from the appropriate array. So how are we going to do that? Well, it makes sense to have a function that does that task of setting any given line to a new line. So let's create a function called setNewLine, and it's going to have a parameter which is the element that we're changing. Okay, so let's at least define that function to begin with. So that's back in our script, obviously. We could put it either above or below random. I'm going to put it above random. So function setNewLine, and it's going to receive an element. So it's going to receive the element on the page that we want to set a new line for. There are different ways of doing this, but this will do. If we're going to set a new line for this element, we need to know whether it should be 5 syllables or 7 syllables, right? So we're going to need some kind of if statement to check which element it is. So write an if statement that checks if the element matches the variable containing either 1, 2, or 3, and depending on which one it matches, set the inner text to a new random line from the correct array. So line 1 and line 3 both would get a 5-syllable line. Line 2 gets a 7-syllable line. It's the same thing that we did up here, except that we need to check which line the element represents. So we can say if the element is equal to line 1p, which means it's the first line, or the element is equal to line 3p. In both of those cases, we want to assign the element's inner text a random line from the 5-syllable line. So we say element dot inner text is assigned a random 5-syllable line. And otherwise, I mean, we're only going to give it elements from our poem, but we'll be explicit anyway. Otherwise, if the element is line 2p, then we know that we want to set its inner text to a random 7-syllable line. Okay, so that now works, right? So that is going to take an element and set a new line. Lovely. Now we want to actually use that function when the user clicks on a line. So we need a function that's going to handle clicking. So it makes sense to define this event handler first, I think, so that it exists. You can do it in either order. So define a function called line clicked. It's going to be an event handler, so it should receive a parameter called event, like all line event handlers should, and it's just going to call set new line on event.target. So the click comes, it goes to the line clicked event handler, and it calls set new line on whatever got clicked, event.target. So let's do that. I'm going to do that above this one. So line clicked event, and we're going to say set new line on the event.target. So that way, if I click line 1, it's going to give it line 1. If I click line 2, it's going to give it line 2, etc. And we know that set new line will give that line the appropriate actual text. Then it remains, as you might have imagined, to add our click event. So we need to add 3 click event listeners, 1 to each paragraph, and it should call line clicked when the click happens. So we're doing this in a pretty specific order. So let's do this. Line 1 p dot add event listener. What's the name of the event? Click. And what function should it call? Line clicked. The reason it's good to do this with a named function is we're going to do it 3 times, right? Because we want to do it for each of the different lines. Oh, that was silly. So each one of those has an event handler. You can kind of see here that there's probably an improvement to be made here in terms of I'm just kind of repeating the same idea over and over again. It's likely that we could have a function that just sets up each line correctly at the beginning of the program. So every line has a click event that calls this nice line clicked function. The line clicked function knows that it's supposed to set a new line for whichever thing got clicked, event.target. That's why we can use the same function for each one. And we knew that set new line will work out which element it was and set the appropriate line. There's quite a lot going on there. And importantly, it's now should be a functional program, right? We should be able to click on lines and have them change. So let's go look. We are all forests, so I'm going to click on that one. You have done your best. Never believe the winds lies. We are all forests. So then if I want to, I could be like, well, there we go. You've done your best. The autumn stretches its legs. We are all forests. That sounds very poignant. So we've got what we wanted, right? I can click these lines and I get different lines coming out. This is like now a pretty neat little generative poetry thing. You can see, by the way, sometimes when I click, nothing happens, and that's because it's randomly choosing the line that was already there. Okay, the cat does not know. Sure enough. So we've got basically the fully functional generator. The final thing I wanted us to do is just have a little bit of visual flair. It turns out that this is kind of a tiny bit sophisticated, so I think it's worth seeing just an approach to doing a transition effect that animates a visual feature of the poem. So we're going to animate by fading these lines in and out. So it's going to, you click a line, it's going to fade out, switch the line when it's not visible, and then fade back in with the new line, which will look nice. It's just a nice effect. And to do that, we have to animate something. We have to animate the opacity of the line. And to do that, we basically need some kind of the idea behind a draw loop, right? And you might remember that the way that we do that in a browser with plain JavaScript is with request animation frame. That's what allows us to repeatedly draw something at the animation frame rate of our browser. So let's do it in the steps. So the first thing we want to do is when you click on a line, we want it to fade out. I'm seeing here that I've said we'll use set interval to do this. We're not going to use set interval to do this. We're going to use request animation frame. So ignore my stupid comment here. I will be deleting that when I finish up here. So define a function called fade out. It's going to take 2 parameters. It's going to take the element to fade out, and it's going to take the opacity that the element is currently going to be set to. Okay? Now there's a reason for this, and I'll talk about it as we go. This is a pretty specific way of writing this idea. So I'm going to put this fadey out thing, where am I going to put it? I'm going to put it in between line clicked and set new line. I happen to know that this is a good place for it. You can put it anywhere. It's not super important. So a function called fade out and it's going to take the element that we should be fading, so the element whose opacity we should be changing, and it's also going to take the opacity of that element right now. The reason I'm doing it this way, passing the opacity through, is it's just going to make our lives a little bit easier. You can just check the opacity of the element using JavaScript, but it's kind of fiddly and not super fun. I've got some discussion of this in the notes around doing this kind of thing, but it's not fun, and this is a fairly efficient way to do this basic effect. So fade out takes the element to fade and the opacity at which it is currently set. So when we begin fading out, we'll set this to 1, right? So what do we do inside fade out? The first thing we should do is we should reduce the number in the opacity by a small amount. I'm suggesting 0.01. So we're going to say opacity minus equals 0.01. So the opacity value that we're going to be using goes down. That's how you fade out, right? Then we're going to set the actual opacity of the element provided to this new value. So that's what's actually going to make it get less opaque, is when we set its style, its opacity style property. So we're going to say element.style. That's how we get access to its CSS. And I want to set its opacity property, which I write in a string like that, personally. And I'm going to assign the new value of the opacity to it. So if the opacity was 1, we subtract 0.01, so we get 0.99, and then we set the new opacity of the element to 0.99. So that's one step of a fade out, right? Wouldn't be very noticeable if we looked at it because it's such a tiny amount, but if we did that over and over again over time, eventually it would reach 0 and the element would be completely opaque, transparent, my bad. So how are we going to check whether we should keep going or not? So we want to check, is the opacity still greater than 0? That's how we'll know whether we should keep fading out. So let's do that. If the opacity, which is this number here, is greater than 0, what should we do? We want to fade it out some more, right? Now, how are we going to fade it out again? Well, we could just say, oh, I guess we'll do fade out element with the opacity, and that will take it down another notch. But if we do this, we're going to create an infinite loop, right? Because fade out is just going to be like calling itself over and over and over again. So not an infinite loop, but just like a loop that takes no time, effectively. It's just going to fade out instantly, so there's not really going to be a fade. What we want to do is we want to do this, but we want to do it in the next animation frame, so that each fade out step only takes place with a frame of animation. And we do that by using the request animation frame method or function. And what it expects is a function inside here, but what we're going to do is we're going to write an anonymous function, and we're going to move this idea here into that. So request animation frame is saying it's going to call this anonymous function in the next animation frame. What does the anonymous function do? It fades out another step. So it calls back to fade out, removes a little bit more from the opacity and sets it, and then checks, is it still greater than 0, right? So request animation frame is going to allow us to call fade out once per frame. That's the beauty that's going on here. Now, we could have an else here, right? What should we do if the opacity does reach 0? But for now, let's not put anything in here. We don't want to. Something to do when it's faded out. We're not going to worry about that right now. So this fade out now should work, right? It's going to repeatedly call fade out once per frame. Once we call fade out the first time, reducing its opacity each time and setting the opacity of the element. So what should we do? Well, to activate this in line clicked, instead of calling set new line, let's call fade out. And what are we going to fade out? We're going to fade out event.target, the thing that was clicked, and we're going to start its opacity at 1. We're going to assume that it has an opacity of 1. So let's do that. So instead of set new line here, let's do fade out. Event.target is the element that I want to fade out, and what's its opacity at the beginning? It's 1, because it's fading out from being opaque when I click on it. So the first time I click on any of these lines, it's going to call fade out on that line, starting with an opacity of 1. It's going to start reducing the opacity and setting the opacity on the element with these two lines, and it's going to keep doing that once per animation frame until the opacity is no longer greater than 0, until it reaches 0. So let's go and look at what that would look like if it works. So I'm going to click on this line here, click. Oh, and it faded away. and nothing, right? Because we know that in our code, when we fade it away to 0, in the else, there's nothing there for it. It doesn't do anything when it reaches 0. It's just gone. So we have this kind of beautiful transient poem that's there one day and gone the next. If I click on it again, you'll notice that we see it again, right? Because it's assuming that the opacity is 1. It sets the opacity to 1 when it starts fading. So we can actually make the lines come back that way. And even this is actually kind of nice, isn't it? Yeah, we can get something kind of good going on there even. You can imagine like kind of going on from here to do something else. So we've got this idea of a basic kind of a fade. As you can see, it's imperfect, but it's, I think, a good balance of simplicity and nicely written that it's appropriate for us to use right now. It's like a sand mandala, as I say there. So the next thing to do, and kind of the final thing to do, is, well, we know that once it is faded out, we should actually use set new line to switch the line. And we should then fade back in, right? So how do we fade back in? Well, it's kind of going to be the same thing as fading out, right? We want to do that same kind of structure, except that the opacity would start at 0 and go up, right? So same basic structure. So let's write this function that will fade us back in. So we've got fade out there. Let's have fade in down here. Fade in. What is it going to do? Same basic idea. So it's going to take an element and an opacity again. Oh, I forgot to write the word function. Very terrible of me. So it's going to fade it in. It's going to start with an opacity of 0, we assume, and it's going to add to it. So let's just think about it in reverse, right? So the opacity is going to go up. So let's add 0.01 to the opacity. We still need to set that opacity on the element in order to have it take effect visually on the actual web page. And then what do we want to check in order to figure out whether the fade in has finished? Well, if the opacity is still less than 1, it hasn't finished fading in, right? And so we should do the same thing. We should call fade in again on the next animation frame. So we can say, whoop, goodness me. You can see that I'm just kind of mirroring this fade out code here rather than going through the specific steps in the actual activity, because it is just a reversal of fade out, as it should be, right? So request animation frame function, what should we do? It hasn't reached 1 yet, so we should keep fading in. So we should say fade in element opacity. And that's how we'll know to keep going until the opacity reaches 1, and then we'll stop. So that's good. So we've got fading in. What's the other thing that we want to do? Well, we want to start that fade in process. So we want to switch the line and fade in. Where do we want to do that? We want to do that when the fade out reaches 0. That's what we're talking about down here. So we know that the fade out reaches 0 here, right? I even included this else so that we would have a place to do it. So if the opacity is greater than 0 while we're fading out, we keep requesting animation frames and fading out again. Eventually it will get down to 0, and then this else will trigger. And that's where I want to swap the line. So how do I swap the line? I use my nice set new line function, set new line, with the element that I am fading, right? That's the thing that wants to be changed. So that is called element. And then what do I want to do once I've got the new line? I want to fade it in. So I call the fade in function on my element. And what's opacity? Well, I can actually just pass the opacity through here, or I can explicitly say, well, I know that it's starting at 0, so I'm just going to set it to 0 here. Both of those will work, right? Maybe it's slightly classier to use the opacity variable here. I don't know. No, actually, I kind of like the explicitness of the 0. That makes sense to me. So now we've got this kind of chain of stuff happening, right? We've got an event listener that says, tell me when there's a click, and call line clicked. Line clicked calls fade out on the thing that was clicked, starting with an opacity of 1. Fade out reduces that opacity and sets it, and then keeps doing that each animation frame for as long as the opacity is greater than 0. As soon as that's not true and it reaches 0, it switches the line, which the user can't see because it's currently got an opacity of 0, and starts the fade in process by calling fade in. And what does fade in do? Does the same basic idea. It keeps adding to the opacity and setting it on the element so that you see it, and it keeps doing that for as long as the opacity is less than 1. And that's how you get your fading in effect. Let's go look at that and see if that worked. So O to be a tree, I click it, fades out, fades back in as we are all forests. O to be a tree, they are all gone now. They are all gone now. Very sad. Let's have our new poem. So we are all forests. Nothing can satisfy you. They are all gone now. I don't actually like that one so much. Maybe you like it more than I do. Let me change that one. Hey, rude. Now you can actually see when it generates the same one twice, right? Because, oh, that's nice though. Because you see it fade out, switch to the same thing and fade back in, which is kind of nice too. So we are all forests. They will not come back again. They are all gone now. Beautiful, beautiful. Brings a tear to my eye. So that's our program, right? We've got the base level kind of generation thing was like relatively straightforward to get going, and then the fading in and out thing was actually kind of a semi-sophisticated process of using request animation frame to make something happen frame by frame. But we did it. We got this kind of cool thing running. There's improvements to be made. In particular, one thing I'm not mentioning here that I could mention is this stuff up here is super repetitive. I think there's a very good case to be made that we should probably be turning this stuff into a function that we provide with the correct set of, with a nice set of variables that just, parameters that do all of these things per line, because there's too much similarity here. This is not a good idea. And then what else could we do? Well, there's lots, and I made a list of lots of things that we could do. You could add speech recognition to this. You could add different kinds of visual effects. You could add sound effects. You could use CSS animations. You could add other interactions. You could turn it into a sonnet generator if you want. You could use something like ML5 text kinds of features to do things with it as well. There's a huge number of possibilities because it's just a little framework, right, for random poetry generation. So, lovely. I hope that that made some sense and was a decent representation of how that activity can be turned into the resulting program. Have fun generating poems. I'm looking forward to reading some of your poems. Please post them in the Discord or whatever it is we're using in the future if someone else watches this video. Okay, see you.